take one on your way out. Next week we have one event, I think is Tuesday, correct? Yes, thank you. And there is almost a program every day of the week. By the end of the semester, we have a conference on Puerto Rican-Dominican relations. All Centro sponsor and the Dominican Institute sponsor research. So we welcome you to all those different events that we're sponsoring. Tonight, it's actually the first because we canceled the first one because of a snowstorm, and we rescheduled for some time next month. But in any case, today is the first opening event of the season, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you the chair of the panel that is going to be presented to us, Virginia Sánchez-Korrol. She is Professor Emerita of Brooklyn College, perhaps the best-known historian and scholar in the Puerto Rican community. Published the most read book on From Colonia to Community, outlining the beginnings of the Puerto Rican diaspora, a best-known bestseller book, and by now a classic for all of us. So it's my pleasure to welcome Virginia, and she will proceed to manage the panel. Gracias, Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that all of you braved the cold and you were expecting spring, but sometimes that's not the way it happens. We have a wonderful program today. And I'm very, very glad that I'm going to be a small part of this program because I'm delighted to be able to introduce our two guests, speakers. We're going to begin with Professor David Badillo. David is a historian, Latin American Latino Studies specialist at Lehman College in New York City. He's an alumnus of the University of California at Berkeley and City University of New York. Professor Badillo has published widely in historical journals, and his book, Latinos and the New Immigrant Church, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. A few summers ago, he taught a graduate seminar on religion at the Seminario Evangélico de Puerto Rico, and he has traveled extensively in Latin America and the Caribbean. He is currently completing a history of Mexican-American Latino civil rights, jurisprudence, and advocacy in the 20th century. And I have to add that we're also very, very proud at Brooklyn College that David was with us for a short while, so that he's truly a City University of New York person. Our second speaker So Juan Cartagena is a constitutional and civil rights attorney who is the president and general counsel of LatinoJustice PRLDEF, one of the nation's leading civil rights public interest law offices that represents Latinas and Latinos throughout the country and works to increase their entry into the legal profession. Mr. Cartagena currently lectures on constitutional and civil rights law at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. Juan has written numerous articles on constitutional and civil rights issues and the political representation of poor and marginalized communities, especially Puerto Rican and Latino communities, has recently begun litigating and publishing articles on the effects of mass imprisonment on Latino communities. Mr. Cartagena also wrote, I think, something that is available to the general public, a wonderful article on the contributions of Herman Badillo that appeared in in Angelo Falcon's National Institute of Latino Policy newsletter. And I was really, really glad to see that because that reaches a portion of our community that doesn't usually attend university forums or read the type of books that many of our wonderful enlightened professors are publishing. I believe it's important to keep your hand in both areas. So the way that we're going to work tonight is that Professor Badillo will begin, and then we will go on to Mr. Juan Cartagena, and then I'll do a few little comments, but mostly we want to hear from you. And we want to have a general discussion of the issues that will be raised. and I'll just, field questions and answers. So thank you again, and if you could come up, we could, we have microphones.
I'm going to use PowerPoint here, if everybody can hear me okay, and just call your attention to some family reminiscences. I wanted to do something a little different, something new, so my cousin from Caguas a while back sent me some family photos, and I did some research and genealogy and all kinds of things, so I don't know if you can figure out who this is. This is my dad's father, Francisco Badillo Carrasquillo, and he was born in Caguas, and obviously he played the violin. He was a school teacher, and I think family histories are very important, particularly with migration, but they're also important in this particular case because of where the family came from. They came from the eastern highlands of Puerto Rico, and that was a very big area rich in tobacco farming from 1900 to 1940. And their lives were really conditioned by that. My grandfather was kind of an exception. He was a school teacher, and he was born in Caguas, then he went to Caguas. But as you see, there's a lot that you have to look into deeply about family histories. This were some of his, well, that's my dad there, and this was some of the siblings of my grandfather, Ubaldo and Ana. And as I traced the migration, these folks reappeared. They all reappeared. My grandfather, unfortunately, and my grandma passed away because of a tuberculosis epidemic. So my dad had to live with a lot of these folks, and these networks that were established very early reappeared in New York and in Chicago, of all places. But this is the beginning, and this is the how the family existed. This is the heart of the people who formed the original migration of the Badillos. That's my dad's grandfather, seated to the left. Badillo Santiago, and he was he had a very interesting life. He came from Aguadilla. There were two parts to the family. There were costeños who came from Aguadilla, and Gregorio was born in Aguadilla, and the family goes way back into the late 1700s there. And the mother's side were more, you know, from La Serranía, La Caguas, all there, but more townspeople, actually. But my great-grandfather, somehow or other, when the Americans were coming over, the Puerto Rican campaign, he enlisted in the Puerto Rican Volunteer Regiment, which was stationed in Henry Barracks in Caguas. So he moved from Aguadilla to Caguas, and that's where everybody was born, except Caguas. Later they came to Caguas. So that's my grandfather there, and his brother, Herman, for whom my father was named after, and Tomas. And Herman and Tomas were the first migrants of the family. They came over to New York. Tomas came to New York in 1927, and Herman came to New York the following year. Then he ended up in Chicago, and they were one of the first Puerto Ricans on record that I can see that lived in Chicago in 1930 census. They were listed there, along with Gregorio came there briefly, but he went. So when you look at the family history, everybody was moving around all over the place. There was an internal, regional migration in Caguas. Then they were going to New York. Then somebody got the idea to go to Chicago. And all this really proved very important for my dad, because when he came to New York in 1941, he came with somebody from the other side of the family, but having people in these strategic locations proved to be very important. So tracing a family history has been very rewarding. It's given me an appreciation, and I think Herman Badillo is such a well-known person, but it's good to see where people come from, and you understand more. And I knew my relatives, and I've been in touch with them for many years, and just piecing it together, though, has been very rewarding. This is Gregorio when he applied for a pension. They listed his three times when he enlisted, and they actually go back. The Puerto Rico Volunteer Regiment was composed of volunteers, and I think in Aguadilla, the American Army was stationed there briefly, or pretty early on, so probably he must have had some exposure to that, and when they were forming this volunteer brigade, he was 19 years old, and there wasn't a lot to do in Aguadilla. I'm sure he wasn't going to be a farmer and all that, so he somehow got enlisted, or he volunteered for this, and these are the 3 times, in 1900, 1903, 1907, there's some other records, and he considered himself a veterano. I don't think he saw a lot of action. He was on garrison duty probably most of the time, marching from Calle to Caguas, doing infrastructure and all that, but this group was actually the forerunner of the 65th Infanteria, who, in 1908, when this group disbanded, there were a couple hundred of them, they were officially joined to the U.S. Army. And, but anyway, so Gregorio got around, and I mentioned the Badillo ancestry, and this I found really amazing because the family legend was that, oh, somebody came over, and so I was thinking, oh, the family really doesn't go that far back. But when I started looking at the civil records, and I saw from Gregorio, you can trace it. The Spanish civil records are available from 1985 to the present, and you can get the death certificates and birth certificates, and this is a death certificate, and they put everything there. They put the grandchildren, they put the grandparents, they put where they're from. So here, with Gregorio, and then I looked for Lorenzo, and I could kind of match it up and make sure I had the right Badillos there, because there was other groups of Badillos who were into other things, and but this is the group. And Sebastián Badillo y Soto died this is in 1891, and it says here he was 90 years old, and it says that his parents, that he was a natural de Aguadilla, and his parents were naturales de Aguadilla, so we're going in 1780s in there, and Aguadilla was basically broken off from Aguada around that time, 1775. So they go way back, and so they move, coming to Caguas, or Calle actually, which was where the soldiers were, that was a big deal. And I suspect too that when the family grew up in Calle, like my grandfather, that they had more opportunities there. They had access to American soldiers, to English, and my grandfather was a school teacher, and in those days the books were in English and the upper grades were in English, so he was part of that whole Americanization of the island. But it was a big change for them. This is my dad's mom, Carmelita, and she was born in Calle. He had 2 sisters, and this is his grandmother, Secundina Carasquillo, and to the right is my dad's mom, and to the left is Aurelia, and Aurelia proved to be very important in the migration process, because the families kind of, even though there were deaths and all that, the families kept together, different sides of the family. So the migration and everything was tied together. They even lived sometimes in the same parts of cities and all that. It didn't matter that, what happened. But anyway, so this is his maternal side of the family, and this is the 3rd sister, Maria Sorrentini. And she stayed in San Juan. She visited New York, but she didn't like it too much. She was always complaining about, oh, the steam, I don't like the steam, And she was a Puerto Riqueña, and she was also, because of all this family movement that was going on, they had to have places for the kids to stay. She ended up taking one of Jaya's kids, Manolin, and raising him, and my dad, that allowed Yaya to bring her other, Jose Luis, and my dad to Puerto Rico. So, but they used to send me back to Puerto Rico over the summers, and I used to stay with Mary. And although she became pretty urbanized in Santurce, I remember swinging those chickens around and hanging them up, and I'd never seen anything like that in New York City. But that was Puerto Rican culture, and it was very much, it was very much evident. This is Yaya when she was in New York. She was the matriarch. About 20 years older than my dad, but she took the two of them on SS Coamo in 1941 to El Barrio. They went to 108th Street, Lexington Avenue, and she did what she had to do. She had a lot of experience in Calle. She was working for La Perrera, which was the Puerto Rican version of the New Deal. She was probably involved in a lot of other things that gave her access to the outside world, and it enabled her to seize the opportunity when the tobacco industry, and she was listed as a clasificadora in tobacco, and by 1940 that was it. The tobacco industry was gone in that whole region. So she was right there, and she took my dad, and he stayed there for a little while in New York. Then she still had her other child that she had to take care of, and my dad was another mouth to feed. But there was Herman and there was Tomas, who were in Chicago. By this time, Tomas had gone to, we're talking 1941, during the war. Tomas went to work for Lockheed in Southern California, but Herman was, and Ana, one of the other aunts, was in Chicago. So my dad stayed a little while in Chicago. Then he went to Southern California with his uncle, stayed there a couple of years to New York. This is Yea's dad, Eloy Rivera. This family is from Calle, Aguas Buenas, that whole tobacco region. And he worked also in the tobacco industry, but also by 1940 he was too old to go to New York. But it was tough. It was really, really tough for everybody during that period, and in Puerto Rico, and you know, everywhere. I don't know if you could read this, but at the bottom, this is the census just before. No, this is the manifest for the SS Coamo, which the bottom three there, you have my dad and Jeria and Jose Luis, and this is in April of 1941, where they arrived in New York City. And I can't imagine. It's like, I guess, the Europeans coming over, not as long a trip, but it's not like getting on the airplane in 6 hours. The people in the 40s and the 50s, they didn't realize how easy they had it. These folks had to be there for days. They had to get from, you know, Caguas to Puerto de Tierra, wherever the boats were leaving from, and go through that whole voyage. It was a really, this is the pre-Great Migration of Puerto Rico, those years. And as I said, I was doing some other research and found out the Badillos here, this is the, they were going, and this is 1935, one of my aunt and my uncle, and we located them. And there was another one, this is Herman Badillo going to, that's not him, that's his uncle, but 1928 going to 144th Street in Harlem. And this one is the other uncle, Tomas Badillo, in 1927, going to Adams Street in Brooklyn. So they got around, and it wasn't unusual. Puerto Ricans migrated, and you know, then so he's in New York, and he has to adjust to all the things that are going on. He lived in living in California, I think, was beneficial. I gave him a way out of the barrio, at least temporarily. He was in an area now where he was in able to assimilate, to learn the language. By 1942, 1943, he was picking it up. I don't think he learned English in Caguas. And then he, but he came back. He moved in with Yaya, and this is as a college student, and he was in City College. And he worked through as much as he could. He met my mom. My mom was, she was a few years older, so she had a very good job. I guess not very good. She worked in an office as a secretary, but it was a full-time job. It was a permanent job. She could support him while he finished up the last 2.5 years at City College. And it wasn't easy, even in New York. And those times were pretty hard for everybody. But anyway, my dad, he'd never been back to Puerto Rico since making that trip in 1941, but somewhere in there, like maybe when he graduated, he took his bride to Puerto Rico. He came to visited Mary in Santurce, and but by this time, he was a student. I don't think he had any political ambitions. We're talking the early 1950s. He'd gotten out of City College. Even though you can graduate at the top of your class at City College, in 1951, the doors aren't open for you. And he had to scrimp and get by. He tried to get certified as an accountant, and that took a while. And then he went to law school at night. But these things took a long time. Now, these days, if you're at the top of your class at City College, and you want to go to law school, you have Yale Law School coming, offering all these offers, full tuition and all that. But this was the 1950s, and it was tough. So he was a lawyer. He had no political ambitions, I think, at this time. He wanted to be successful, and politics proved to be a way to reach his goals. And as he describes it, he was able to make some contacts as a tax lawyer with some of the judges, and they got him involved with people in the community that, maybe you can go visit some people, you can get them registered. And this thing about getting people registered is very important, because we're going to touch on the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act and voting and all of that, he was the perfect person for this. The stars were aligned for him, because as to do as a lawyer, he had these opportunities to start getting people registered to vote. And this happened even during the late 1950s. There were clubs around there, Caribe Club and Tony Mendez's club, and he was seen as a person who could do that, who could talk to people. He could go to bodegas, he could go on the street. They were living in Kew Gardens at the time, my parents, and they stayed together for 10 years. But this carries through to this whole period as he's getting ready to make his political move. So he was aware of the fact that there was a need to register people and all of that. And it really took steam in 1960 with the presidential campaign of JFK. And by that time, I mean, he was still a lawyer, but he didn't want to be a tax lawyer, and he didn't have a lot of other options. He ran for district leader, and he was kind of getting ready to make a political move, and that's when it really all came together. And the JFK campaign was a perfect venue for that. JFK had, and particularly Bobby Kennedy, had set up what they called Viva Kennedy clubs throughout the Southwest, where the Mexicans, I mean, they were able to vote, but they weren't mobilized, so they would set up these clubs, and they wanted to do something similar among the Puerto Rican population. The Puerto Rican population was a vast, untapped reserve. Many of them were unregistered for a variety of reasons, but my dad found it, first of all, in his interest to register the people, and it was in their interest too. It was a perfect mixture of his political ambitions and the needs of the people. And so this campaign for Kennedy worked out very well for everybody. And he helped register Puerto Ricans. He went through some court cases with the Board of Elections where they were keeping them out. They were closing the polls early, all kinds of things like that. And it was a big movement. And little by little, his political star increased. He was appointed commissioner by Robert Wagner, and he served as two types of commissioners. He was a housing commissioner, and that was the main thing, which he did from around 1962 to 1965. And all this while, he was registering people. And the big issue that was coming up at the time was the New York State Constitution had a literacy provision, and it was passed by the people of New York State. Well, what can you do? How do you go about challenging that? It wasn't. If you look at the literacy test, it was a paragraph and with about 10 questions there, and you couldn't answer the questions without reading. It would be something like about Alexander Hamilton or Miles Standish or something like that. I mean. But it was answerable, but you had to be able to speak English. And for the Puerto Ricans who were coming there, I mean, if you were native born and you'd gone to the 8th grade, you get a pass. But for people who were coming over, and even though they were citizens, they were considered out-of-state residents or whatever, so they had to take the literacy test. And it was a terrible tool of disenfranchisement that people were beginning to realize was not a good thing, and it was not a good thing politically. So even Robert F. Kennedy realized at the time that the Puerto Ricans, they have to be registered somehow. And that brings us to the 1965 Civil Rights Act, because my dad still was not elected to anything. But the hearings were coming up for the Civil Rights Act, and it just happens that in addition to all the provisions they had to protect Southern blacks and to abolish the literacy tests in the South, that Robert Kennedy and Senator Javits, after all that was being plotted out, had an idea that we should enfranchise the Puerto Ricans by challenging this literacy test. And it was a very difficult thing to do because you're trying to pass congressional legislation of this nature, but they managed to slip in this thing about having no literacy test for people who were born in American flag schools who could prove that they had a 6th grade education. And this actually came up in the actual hearings of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And my dad went to testify representing a whole group of federations. And I think he made I read through the transcript. I think he made a really good impression. People were obviously impressed just at the way he was articulating constitutional theories. I mean, it was a pretty difficult thing. They were saying that basically we have to pass an act of Congress which is going to overturn a state law, and that wasn't even settled until a court case, Katzenbach versus Morgan, a year or two later. But my dad was on top of it, and he went there with Irma Vidal Santillana and Gilberto Herrera Valentin, and the three are listed in the transcript jointly as testifying, but he's the only one who was saying anything. And it was very convincing testimony, and I think it did the job. And this was in March of 1965, about 2 weeks after Selma. And he was, you know, he contextualized the whole thing about Puerto Ricans in this context of Southern blacks. And after the bill went through, these were the House hearings, it went to the Senate, Javits, Kennedy, they massaged it and put it through, and as I say, the court case confirmed it the following year. And it was a tremendous thing and a culmination of his knowledge of voting rights. And I didn't get into the details, but he was on the ground very much, you know, in the 1950s, 1960s, he basically lived in the clubs. So he had his pulse on everything that was going on in the communities and all that. And he had his eye on higher ambitions. So just at the time that this testimony was happening, he was planning his first major election, which was for Bronx Borough president. And in the summer of 1965, I guess sometime around June, was the primary. He defeated the Democrat candidate, and then he went on to become borough president by defeating the Republican liberal candidate. And I remember the campaign. I was only about 9 years old, but it was a real cliffhanger. And most of his early elections were squeakers. And voter registration for him was essential. He needed every vote. And but he got through it. He became borough president, and he was very good at articulating the issues. And this time, 1960s, that's when TV was becoming huge. People were seeing everything on their TV screens. It was for the riots, the protest march, the anti-Vietnam, everything. So Herman Badillo was there with his 30-second sound bites and interviews, and he was right up the Chicago Democratic Convention. And he became very well known. And it's remarkable also that he was so symbolic of the success of Puerto Ricans. My relatives in California, Chicago, I mean, imagine they're just sitting there minding their own business, and they see, you know, hey, that's Herman, or, you know, that's little Herman. He was a borough president, and in New York City. And I mean, okay, it was a county executive. We give them the exalted titles, president of the Bronx, but he had his limousine to take him around, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal for not only for our family. I think a lot of Puerto Ricans there to have that visibility, to see somebody to do that, who could do that, and who was doing it. And then he began to be mentioned for mayoralty. So he served one term as a borough president. You can't run for both borough president and mayor, so he retired borough president. In 1969, he ran for mayor. He lost. It was pretty close. It was pretty close. He took a year off, or he prepared. He knew he wanted to run for mayor again, but he decided to run for Congress, and that was another squeaker. And in 1970, he was elected as the first Puerto Rican congressman, and he had to have some kind of agenda. I spoke with some of his staff members there, and they all tell me when he went to Congress, he knew he was going to run for mayor again. That was a given. Call it ambition, stubbornness, whatever. But also he was a congressperson. But the first couple of years, he found his way around. He did what he had to do. He was involved in appropriations bills, and nothing really too big at this time. Then in 1973, he ran for mayor again. It was very, very close. He got into the runoff. It was a stinging defeat. 1974, he was still in Congress because staggered. 1974 was his legacy year, 1974 and 1975. And this is something I really admire. After coming back from that second stinging defeat, he went in guns blazing in 1974. 1974 was the year of a lot of bilingual education activity, the Loud decision, a spirit of consent decree, and he pushed a very big appropriations in 1974 for the bilingual education bill. It was an omnibus bill that passed then. And there was something else too. He had been working on other bills, in the banking committee, and it was beginning, the leadership was beginning to see, okay, he can handle some really big stuff. And that's where the Voting Rights Act amendment came in 1975. And he took this momentum, and the Voting Rights Act was coming up for renewal. And the issue was not the Puerto Rican literacy test now. There were other issues about all kinds of things with the Mexican Americans. I mean, they had been working on trying to extend Section 5 to outside. So this whole area, they're very active in San Antonio, Houston, Corpus Christi. There were groups, Mexican American organizations like LULAC, and then MALDEF was coming along, the Mexican American Legal Defense Education Fund, and they wanted to maneuver into this area of not just extending the old Voting Rights Act, but making it more broadened, and particularly to include Texas. So since 1973, there had been some really important court cases. So my dad's, well, I think, I don't see this is a lot of the political sausage making, but it seems that he was tasked on that particular committee, the subcommittee on the judiciary, of taking the Voting Rights Act and adding this aspect of expansion through Section 5, and also provision of bilingual ballots. So looking through those hearings, what his job there was as a congressperson was to bring witnesses in, and MALDEF helped a lot too, and there was some coordination there, I'm sure. But he was very good at organizing things, and also he had to question the Southerners because they were trying to wiggle out of extending various provisions, so he had to be on top of all these different things that were going into the legislation. And it was not an easy thing to introduce the idea of bilingual ballots or extending. The Section 5 has to do with the pre-clearance requirements, and very complicated stuff, but everybody, at that time, that was the post-Watergate Congress, so there was a lot of bipartisanship, and everybody was pretty much on board, except for the Southerners, for extending the Voting Rights Act. But the Hispanic part, I think he had a lot to do with it. So you could see that he managed to subtly address a lot of, for instance, one of the constitutional issues was dealing with, are Latinos a race or an ethnic group? And the way that was approached was, were they going to be covered under the 15th Amendment or the 14th Amendment? And my dad was pointing out that definitely you can't consider Puerto Ricans or any kind of Latinos a race because they go through the whole spectrum. But through the Equal Protection Clause, you could show they were discriminated against. And that's what actually happened in 1965 with that particular amendment. So he had to develop this whole strategy, and Barbara Jordan testified there, and she was on board for a lot of the stuff. She wanted the bilingual ballots, but she wanted them extended to all different language minorities. But whatever it was, it ended up passing. President Ford signed the bill. And it had a very lasting impact, and that was his contribution. Just on a lot of different levels, there were a few people who testified from the various, Vilma Martinez. He had to know exactly what to ask the people and how to get the thing, without making it too big, because you don't want to make a whole national issue out of the Latino voting rights either, because you wanted to get it under the radar. So he was very good at that. And I mention all this because it's hard to determine what a person's legacy is. You can determine where they came from, and I think that's important, and what they did. So this is something that he did, and it reflected his skills and his confidence. I mean, to be there in the halls of Congress and be confident enough to be dealing with constitutional issues and all these different minorities, and and to be bouncing back from all these other things. He had these goals, and he left Congress when he was he'd had his fill. I mean, he wasn't going to be there for the rest of his life. He determined that he wanted to be mayor. Let's face it, that was it. But in the meantime, he became the borough president, and he got all this legislation passed. And as I say, he served as this visible cultural icon. So there's that other part of his legacy too, which I can't really speak to, because for me, he's my dad first. And but regardless of what he was appointed to or elected to, and all of that, but I understand that that's the way it is. He's a cultural icon. So I thought it would be interesting just to give this perspective, and we can get into all this later if you want for the discussion. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. My name is Juan Cartagena, and I head up the LatinoJustice Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. And I wanted to spend a few moments elaborating on some of the points that I raised in previous writings regarding Herman Badillo's legacy. Here in David's presentation, I can actually cut mine almost in half. We overlap considerably in what we were planning to say for today. I was going through a lot of materials when I learned of his passing, and I conclude, similar to I think what David is concluding, that one of the biggest legacies of Herman Badillo was his legacy in the area of voting rights for Latino citizens of the United States. As much as he's been a pioneer in so many areas, and as much as he had a significant role in bilingual education, this particular effort of his was incredibly important in the way that it exacerbated the opportunities of integrating the halls of legislative power. The Voting Rights Act of '65 is considered the most effective piece of civil rights legislation in our history. It literally increased the number of black and Latino elected officials like 3,000–4,000 times. Is attributable to the integration of legislations throughout the country. And it's attributable to making sure that democracy is much more expansive than it was in the 60s. So the fact that we had this incredible opportunity in '65 because of the efforts of Herman Badillo and others is what I highlighted in previous writings, and I just want to focus on a few of them today. So you heard David speak about the fact that New York State had a literacy test. It actually is enshrined in the Constitution of New York State since 1921. There's all of the historians and all of the accounts, and I've read portions of the Constitutional Convention proceedings that led to the enactment of the literacy test were significant in that it was aimed at the burgeoning tide of Eastern European and Southern European immigrants who were also quickly enveloped in the entire local political structure. There would be no doubt in my mind that if we had an opportunity to assess the constitutionality of that provision of law, given its blatant racist overtones, it would have been a very, very interesting case. But, you know, the entire history of the United States in the area of voting is a history of exclusion, right? That's all what voting rights is about. It's treating a right as if it was a privilege. And even today, in 2015, we still deal with the remnants of that philosophy. It's why so many people have to re-earn that privilege to vote by showing who they are with excessive attempts to show voter ID laws, by showing who they are with respect to ridiculous challenges to their citizenship status. It's all part of a long trajectory of exclusion and marginalization. So the literacy test is one form of evidence of that exclusion. In '59, a lawsuit that reached the Supreme Court actually ruled that literacy tests were constitutional. They were permissible. The commentary in that Supreme Court case actually demonstrated that having an intelligent voting populace is a laudable goal of any state, which actually, you know, raises other questions about what it meant for voting at that time and what it means for voting today. So one of the objects, of course, of the Voting Rights Act was to attack literacy tests because they were especially pernicious in their effects and as applied to black voting strength throughout the South. So it wasn't just that you can attack literacy tests because by themselves they're unconstitutional. It's that you had to attack them by the way they were administered. And you've seen all the episodes in our history accounts of how those exams were administered. You know, Fannie Lou Hamer, who's an amazing woman in the area of voting rights, has been known to say she was rejected in her first attempt to register to vote in Mississippi. And the second time she was accepted. And when she tried to vote, she got fired as a sharecropper on the plantation that she worked on. But her first attempt, she was given a provision of the Constitution and asked to interpret it. And it was done in such a way that she could understand what this very provision of the Constitution ever meant. And she was quoted saying, "I know enough about that clause in the Constitution as a horse knows about Christmas." The outrageous implementation of literacy tests were the object of the Voting Rights Act because they, like grandfather clauses and like poll taxes, were all part of Jim Crow to stop the large number of African Americans in the South from taking what was rightfully theirs, that is, a seat at the table given their numbers. So the questions in the literacy test throughout the South were outrageous. What we see in New York is a different phenomenon. As David mentioned, New York had an English literacy requirement. So not just you had to be literate, but you had to be literate in English. And the fact of the matter is that was, of course, by the time of the 50s and the 40s, and especially the 60s, given the large number of Puerto Ricans who were coming to the island, to New York State, a feature of another form of exclusion. So the first challenge to the literacy test requirements in New York State were done by a man named Jose Camacho, in that case that I have on the screen. In that case in '61, demonstrated that Camacho was asserting claims that it was both unconstitutional and a violation of his rights both under international law and domestic constitutional law. As David mentioned, there was a lot of extremely intense political activity among Puerto Rican populations in New York City between those two world wars. And you had the incredible attraction of Vito Marcantonio as an incredible force that galvanized Puerto Rican voters throughout that period. And you also had the election of the first Puerto Rican ever in the history of the United States, Oscar Garcia Rivera, in 1937. On both, I believe, the Republican Party line and the American Labor Party line. So you had incredible activity, which of course then produced a backlash. The backlash with respect to Vito Marcantonio's success was pretty clear by mayoral commissions and mayoral offices to assist Puerto Ricans in their integration into New York City's life as a counterbalance of what Vito Marcantonio was doing on his own. and with the backlash with respect to the Liberal Party and destroying the political power of the nascent Oscar Garcia Rivera power in both the American Labor Party and the Republican Party at the time. So the backlash was there, and that's the context that allowed this particular challenge to go forward. For all purposes, unfortunately, this particular effort was unsuccessful. The court actually dismissed all the claims that it was a violation of either the Constitution of the United States to have an English literacy requirement that actually stops Puerto Ricans from voting in New York, and also a violation of international law. The international law claims were novel. There aren't that many cases in the 60s that appended international law claims to what is essentially a civil rights case. Unfortunately, this was also dismissed. By the time May came around, you heard David talk about how his father, Herman Badillo, was part of the congressional record in the hearings in March. But May, in the subcommittee of the judiciary, was the first time that the first green light given to Section 4E of the Voting Rights Act, which I'll talk about to you in a minute. This particular count is from the Chicago Tribune, but the Times also covered that particular episode. There was a raising, interesting for me anyway, commentary from Jacob Javits, who was asked pointedly, you championing the cause of Puerto Rican voters, isn't that going to hurt both your re-election campaigns in the future and the election campaign of then John Lindsay? And he said, I'm doing it anyway. I think it's good. I'm not worried about what it means for the Republican Party. Eventually, this is good for all New Yorkers. That bipartisanship that David talked about before was clearly evident in the 1965 Act. It was, of course, as you know, that provision of the law, that episode in our history in which the United States, given the leadership of all levels, was galvanizing around the right to vote. So Section 4E is not that complicated, although the words are pretty obtuse, just like the legislation is typically written. But it effectively says that in order to secure the rights of citizens of the United States who are educated in an American flag school in which the predominant language of instruction was other than English, Congress had to do something. So as you know, effectively, the territory that which they're talking about is Puerto Rico. The whole back and forth episodic elements of how language of instruction was Spanish at times and English at other times, English and Spanish and then at other times in Puerto Rico is an episode for another history class. But by the time Congress came around to pay attention to these issues, the question was whether or not they were educated in Spanish or in the words of this language, or the statute, in a language other than English. And therefore, Congress wanted to do something to ensure that they wouldn't be stopped from voting just because they were educated in a language other than English. So the actual provision says that a person who demonstrates they receive a 6th grade education in any one of those territories, accredited, or a private school accredited by any one of those other territories, in which the language of instruction was other than English, cannot be denied the right to vote in any federal, state, or local election because of inability to read, write, understand, or interpret any matter in the English language. So I want you to take a step back for this for one very important reason, because I think David alluded to the fact that the hearing was in March, right after Selma. We are now, the country was just focused on Selma's anniversary, etc. So it was very, very unique. I referred to Section 4E of the Voting Rights Act as demonstrating that the Voting Rights Act of '65 was never just black and white. And it was very, very unique to have Congress even focus on any other part of the country that was not the Deep South, given the historical mobilization of our civil rights leaders in this country to ensure that Congress did something about the Voting Rights Act, about the lack of voting power. So this is pretty amazing. A Latino provision in what is otherwise an act that's normally been read and interpreted as providing the impetus for protecting the dignity of the black vote. And that provision, therefore, remained and still is, by the way, in existence today. So Section 4E operates today to ensure this kind of protection in many ways. It's not used as often enough because we have the bilingual assistance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which I'll talk about as well in a minute. And here's one of my favorite comments from the floor in '65. There's a senator from Holland, Senator Holland from Florida. In response to the efforts of Javits and Kennedy in New York to have a provision for Puerto Ricans in the Voting Rights Act, he was quoted as saying, in the state of Florida, there are tens of thousands of Latin American lineage citizens, many of whom are not yet able to speak English language, but yet amply educated to know what they are doing. For years, we have permitted them to vote, and we are very happy in the fact that the great state of New York now turns to us for some guidance in democracy, which we believe the state of New York has needed for a long time. Of course, fast forward to 2008, 2012, what's going to happen in 2016. My office litigates cases against the state of Florida because they try to stop Latinos and blacks from voting like damn near every month. So this juxtaposition of what Florida was saying about New York and what New York could probably say today about Florida is fascinating for me. But those were the commentaries. I won't go through this. You heard this from David. The congressional record affiliates both Herman Badillo and Irma Vidal Santander with the Legion of Voters, and affiliates Helena Valentin with the National Association of Puerto Rican Civil Rights. Their argument was that there were close to 330,000 eligible Puerto Ricans who were unregistered to vote in '65 in New York City alone, compared to only about 150,000 that were registered to vote, and that the literacy test was operating in a way to discriminate and exclude those Puerto Ricans from voting. Their arguments also were that the literacy tests as applied in New York City were also done in a discriminatory fashion. That is, the literacy tests were not evenly available to all eligible citizens, even the ones who could demonstrate English literacy. And all kind of shenanigans by the New York City Board of Elections were evident in the testimony and apparently in the documentation that was used to justify the law, Section 4E. And here's my best quote from Herman Badillo during the testimony. He wanted to destroy the myth that in the state of New York, a citizen can be an intelligent, well-informed voter only if he's literate in English. Given the kind of media attention to, in Spanish media that existed at the time, on world events and everywhere else, this quote is excellent, right? The notion that you can only be smart in English is a notion that had to be destroyed, and in many ways 4E does that very effectively. A year later, a Supreme Court case, Katzenbach versus Morgan, upheld Section 4E from an attack. There was an attack to its constitutionality, and the quote that I have on the slide here is actually from that opinion. So that Section 4E may be viewed as a measure to secure for the Puerto Rican community residing in New York non-discriminatory treatment by government, both in the imposition of voting qualifications, provision or administration of governmental services such as public schools, public housing, and law enforcement. You know, Katzenbach could have said a lot of things. Every time, those of us who do this work always cringe when we have to go before the Supreme Court, because, that's the last frontier, right? And if they say something wrong, they chavate, right? You have no choice. There is no excuse. There's no outlet. There's no escape valve. But it was pretty clear that Section 4E was a Puerto Rican provision. It was clear in the eyes of the justices. It was clear based on the congressional record. And it was clear to anybody who knew anything about New York. So this reinforces that incredible focused nature of Section 4E and its place within the history of the Voting Rights Act. So I want to end with this. I don't have time to really elaborate upon this unless we can talk about it during the question and answer if you like. But the legacy of 4E is significant. The legacy of 4E, first of all, goes well beyond '65. The last time I saw a lawsuit filed under Section 4E was recently as 2 or 3 years ago. So it lives today. It is used in pockets of the United States when you have large Puerto Rican communities in which the local Board of Election refuses to provide for bilingual assistance. As recently used in places like Berks County, Pennsylvania. We did a case in my office in Volusia County, Florida, within the last 5 or 6 years. So yes, it is viable. It exists and it lives today, and it can be used today. It goes well beyond New York. It follows the diaspora, as you can imagine, because there are no limits about its application in the country. And finally, and probably even more importantly, it goes well beyond Puerto Ricans. By the time 1975 rolled around, and Herman Badillo was in Congress at this time, and David talked about an incredible role that he played in the bilingual voting rights amendments of 1975, the best quote that I saw in the congressional record was something to the effect of, bilingual voting systems cannot be deemed a radical notion in the United States because they have been doing it in New York since 1965. It can't be that radical if it happens in New York. It can't be that radical if Puerto Ricans were allowed to vote in a bilingual system and somehow the sky didn't fall. It couldn't be that radical if no one was questioning or challenging elections for president or Congress or Senate based on the fact that Puerto Ricans were allowed to vote in a language they can understand. So the fact of the matter is that between 65 and 75, you had quite a number of lawsuits. The lawsuits were far-ranging. They all used Section 4E. By 1972, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund was actually born, and all those lawsuits were filed by my predecessors at the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund. And they were filed in Pennsylvania and Chicago and New Jersey and upstate New York and, of course, in New York in various ways. There's about 3 lawsuits I can rattle off the top of my head that talked about 4E. But the most important of which was a case called Torres versus Sachs. And that case basically said that the English-only system is effectively a test or precondition to voting. That helps us out, us voting rights lawyers, in a Section 5 application later on. A story that would take me another half hour to go through, but it's another fascinating history lesson as well. But the other thing that Torres versus Sachs said in the federal court in New York was that it can't be a meaningful vote if the individual does not comprehend the voter registration forms, the election forms, and the actual ballot in a language they can understand. You would think that that is an axiom that should find no quarrel, right? It can't be a meaningful vote unless it's cast by somebody who can comprehend the forms and the ballot. But in the 1970s, these were radical notions by any court. It actually mirrors in many ways what Lau versus Nichols said in 1974 about bilingual education. Which, by the way, Lau versus Nichols doesn't say anything about bilingual education. It says that children who sit in a classroom given the same curriculum, the same textbooks, the same teachers, the same inputs, cannot meaningfully have an equal educational opportunity if they don't understand the language of instruction. It literally upended sink or swim, which had been the common form of pedagogy throughout the United States public schools all the way through 1974. But that simple notion that it can't be of equal opportunity if you don't understand it, it was reflected in the voting rights cases and reflected in Lau versus Nichols in 74. More or less in the same framework of the same judges on federal courts at the time. So in many ways, this legacy of Section 4E became, as I say here, the foundation of all bilingual assistance in 75. I'm not sure I can emphasize enough what that means. I'm not doing it justice today. I am literally talking about every Native American who's able to vote in a language of his or her tribe. Every Latino who is not Puerto Rican able to vote in a language of their home. Every Asian American able to vote in a language of their home countries. Happened in 75 in many ways because Puerto Ricans stood up in 64 and 75 and 65. That history and that chain of legacy cannot be broken. And that's the chain that Herman Badillo contributed to. Thank you.
Thank you both for 2 excellent presentations. Thank you. It really poses some interesting thoughts, because we're talking about legacy on the one hand, which David covers so beautifully in terms of the family history and the events that led eventually to the contributions that Badillo made, and of course Juan's presentation about the importance of the key piece of legislation that then goes on to become the foundation for all of the bilingual education cases from that point on. And I had some interesting questions as they were both speaking. One of them was trying to connect what Juan was saying to the Citizenship Act and to what is happening now with citizenship, and how would this law impact as John Oliver likes to point out, the 4 million Americans who today cannot vote for president or for representation in Washington. And of course, the other point with David is, where did you get those pictures?
Cousins in Caguas.
Those are wonderful, wonderful pictures. And the other point, of course, is I being a women's history scholar, I immediately zero in on Vilma, Irma Santaella, and wonder how, as a graduate of Hunter College, her papers are not at Centro. That's an issue that we have to work on. So I would like to open up to questions and answers from the audience very quickly, because when you hear two presentations like that, you may forget what you wanted to ask in the first place. So let's do it.
I wanted to say that we have to go after those papers for sure, but I also want to say that the Central Archives have the collection for the Puerto Rican Legal Education Fund, and everything that they did has a place in our archives. So you're all welcome to go there and examine the story. And we also started a collection for Herman Badillo, and David was generous enough to donate about 100 photos of his family. This is just a vignette of what he has donated. And we're also going to start a collection from various pieces of donation. You all know that Herman's congressional papers are at Boricua College, but that's only a little piece of his contribution and all the legacy that he left. We know that there is a vast collection of his campaign and his all the trajectory, and we're making every effort to secure that legacy and those papers for Central. We also know that this is the first of various events that are going to happen. So one of the things that we're planning, along with a lot of leadership here in the university, will be a memorial where a public recognition will be granted, and those details will follow. We also want to do a video of about 1 hour collecting, Herman in his own words. Virginia actually conducted a very wonderful interview way back, a few years back, about 2 or 3 years before Herman passed away. And we're editing that along with a lot of other footage that we have identified. This panel and everything they have said will be cut into pieces in clips and will be available for searching through a new application that we're developing, where that will be possible, along with every other thing that they mentioned there. We hope to put together and make it available for scholars to follow the lead of our colleagues here. So in our defense, there is much more work to do, and I'm happy to invite you all to join us in that quest.
Thank you. I congratulate the speakers on an outstanding presentation. The Lau-Nicholas Act was cited. Now, shortly thereafter, the Espita Consent Decree was implemented here in the city of New York, and mention was made of Mr. Badillo's support of bilingual education. Now, we know in bilingual education there are two modalities. There's the transitional that was implemented here in New York City, and the maintenance, which of course has flourished in the state of Florida. Now, my question is, A, did Mr. Badillo endorse the transitional or the maintenance? And number two, was he under pressure from the UFT that literally demonized bilingual education in any facsimile? For example, the way they went after Luis Fuentes, who was the superintendent of District 1, right after the 1975 strike. Because, again, the late Congressman Robert Garcia was an ardent supporter of bilingual education, that is, of the maintenance type.
My dad was not for having bilingual education be a continual thing. I read his book. His book has a lot of good information there about these type of things, and he mentions that he, same with the Voting Rights Act, that he thought it was a good idea at the time. 20 years later, he didn't.
I wanted to ask you something away from the issue of bilingual education, which is of interest to me. But you mentioned Irma Vidal Santaella and Helena Valentin. Mm-hmm. And today I was reading the original version of the Puerto Rican Community Development Project proposal of 1964, in which the name Irma Vidal Santaella and Helena Valentin and many other Puerto Rican leaders are mentioned. They're all involved in the development. 1964-65 was not just the period of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, it was the period of the war on poverty. And so I'm interested for your comments about Herman Badillo's political legacy in relationship to that, because it was happening at the same time that he was in Congress, the Voting Rights Act. So what role do you know or remember his playing in that war on poverty, which was how we developed many of our Puerto Rican community organizations, the Puerto Rican Forum, and many organizations in the Bronx as well as other parts of the city?
I'd refer you to Valentin's book. He has memoirs, and he's more focused on issues of class in that respect. My dad was not really a national figure during that time. He started as borough president in '66, and I think that Valentin's work was very useful also in getting my dad's political career going. He was the head of the Congreso de Pueblos Puertorriqueño. I do remember the Puerto Rican Day Parade, and that was a really big political event, and those were very important things. But as far as the other stuff, there are other people who were much more focused on that.
Well, one of the, if I can jump in on this, one of the things that's interesting about this period, when the Puerto Rican Development Project is first proposed, the project is a comprehensive project. It is intended to raise the economic, the political, the educational, the social, and also the health of the Puerto Rican community at this time. And so the people who were part of the committees, different committees formed for different things, but if you look at the booklet, there's a list of everyone, and then there's a list of people in categories according to what they did. The thing about the Puerto Rican community at that time is that it is basically a helpless community. It doesn't have the political power that other ethnic communities have already garnered. That doesn't mean that they didn't have a political infrastructure within the community. They did. And so whenever a big project like this became important, one of the first things that they did was that they called in all of the politicians, regardless of what party they represented, because they were Puerto Rican first and then a politician second. And it was almost as if they were forming a think tank to see how they were going to be able to move this community forward. Your father was very important in that because he was seen as one of the leaders, as was Tony Mendez, as was Olga Mendez. They were seen as the leaders of the community that had some clout beyond the community. And it's really, really interesting to look at that very early history. We talk about periods of nonpartisanship. That was a period of collaboration that then, as the community begins to grow in size and to disperse into different areas, we don't see that again to the extent that we did at that time. You know, the issue of legacy and role model and who the people are who represent our communities is so important that we kind of take it for granted. But back then, when the community was just beginning to, when this community was fighting the negative images that were printed in the press about them, fighting against Mark Antonio, you know, saying Mark Antonio is bringing the Puerto Ricans up because they're citizens and they could vote. All of the negativity that faced the Puerto Rican community during those early times. I gave a short vignette on the Latino Americans episodes about the Voting Rights Act, and quite by not planned at all, but I happened to talk about my mother and how it was that that I talked her into taking the literacy test. And in the story it goes, you know, I'm talking about how frightened she was. She was not dominant in English at all, but the test was in English. And I remember telling her, but Ma, you got to take it. You got to take it because you got to vote. You know, I'm here, this American daughter, right? You got to vote. You got to go vote. And I remember taking her down to some basement, down the steps to some basement where the literacy test was being given. She was shaking. She could barely fill out the blanks, the answers on the paper. Well, they happened to show that on television, on the television program, The Latino Americans. Professor Cordero Guzman's class saw the episode, and they were so awed by what our community was going through in terms of the literacy acts that they paused the television screen. He told me this. They paused the television screen, made copies of the literacy test. And then they went on to a whole week of discussion and studying about the literacy test and what Herman Badillo was doing to try to erase this stigma from our community, because our community was being disenfranchised. And I thought to myself when he told me the story, the importance of role models, the importance of knowing that there's a person up there who is in an organization that can get things done cannot be underestimated. And that's part of legacy. So.
Hi, my name is George Carver. I'm a freelance photographer, and I've been on the street since the beginning. Congressman Badillo, I always call him a Congressman Badillo. That was, you know, and he never said anything bad about that. But Congressman Badillo, we grew up in the Bronx. We were up there in '52. And when Congressman Badillo became the borough president, that was the greatest thing that could happen to us. We live in an old, mostly Irish neighborhood, Irish Jewish. This was the borough president, Herman Badillo. So Herman Badillo, to us, was the most incredible figure in the world. He was never corrupt. He was never accused of any bad doing or bad dealing or any of that. To me, even to the last day, I thought Congressman Badillo was the greatest man ever. I suggested that they name the rotunda in the Bronx the Herman Badillo because he was the world president there at one time. Well, anyway, one of the great things about the congressman was that he was, when I was going to school, Pier 73, and then aviation high school, I noticed that they would teach us, sit us in the back, because we weren't really that good, and the guy would say, read page 10 to 50, and close the book. That was it. And then I used to hear the congressman on the radio say, you know what these people are doing? They're pushing you right through. I went right through to high school, to grammar school. I didn't even know how to open a pen, write my name on it, you know. And Congressman Badillo was always saying, you guys are screwing us up. You're screwing the young people up. And I was one of those persons, and I always remember that. He was always there saying, hey, you guys are not teaching us, teaching the people, teaching the kids the right way. You're just pushing right through. And I think he finally made a law, had a law passed at the end that he stopped all that. I mean, and then I was fortunate enough to go to that college on 23rd, 26th Street. My daughter was graduated, master and all that, and she was there, and I was so, and the congressman made this speech over there. I said, oh, man, look at that. I just think, to me, Mr. Badillo, I'm not talking about voting rights or any of that, but to me, there was nobody nicer, cleaner, and more perfect. And I talk to people, there's not ever been anybody in the streets, and I've been on the street all these years, and I was just 77 years old, and I never heard anybody said anything bad about the congressman. Great man, and I'm so lucky to be around him.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for such great presentations. As I hear both your presentation, I can't help but think about the relevance of Herman Badillo and Puerto Rican for passing Section 4E. I cannot stop thinking about those, especially the 1921 English literacy requirement. Like, as you say, it's kind of like to stop Southern and Eastern Europeans from voting. I mean, and I take it that the assumption was that they're coming, or the explanation, the main explanation, the non-racist explanation, that they're coming from their experience is authoritarian regime, so they kind of put into a quarantine, they're properly assimilated and welcomed into the family of whiteness with all the benefits. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking, how relevant and how extraordinary, how such an extraordinary subject or case are Puerto Ricans who come in great numbers after half a century of going through American institution and with citizenship. So my question is, how relevant is that Puerto Ricans have been, you know, in 1898 they say we're rescuing the Puerto Rican from the authoritarian Spanish regime, we're going to put them under this democratic regime. So how relevant is that citizenship and that half a century to make the Puerto Ricans an extraordinary case for passing Section 4E?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. There's no question that the political status of Puerto Ricanos when they come here and when they live in Puerto Rico post American occupation is the central piece to extending those voting rights. It wouldn't happen any other way, right? But I also don't want us to think that there was something uniquely special about Puerto Ricans, because at the end of the game, all voting behavior, or I should say all voting reform, right, all electoral reform is at its base a political game. Somebody stood to benefit by extending the voting rights to so many hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans. We can laud them all we want, but somebody's playing political shell game with Puerto Rican voters. So at the end of the day, we can take that and run with it. I mean, that's what I do for a living. I take the words of the forefathers that were never meant to apply to a situation in 2015 and run with it. If they're going to give me the power to use those rights, I'll take that and run with it as long as I can. But I do want to tell you this. I mean, I have the issue of literacy tests in general has always been a fascinating feature for me, because it is a concept that voting should be conditioned on intelligence. And then, you know, how this country has been a sordid history of how do you measure intelligence. Forget that. It takes us to a whole kind of racist places that the country doesn't want to admit. But it was blatantly done in a way for Southern and Eastern European in this part of the country. It was blatantly done against African Americans in other parts of the country. It was blatant. It was obvious that they were passing these laws. It's not that dissimilar from another feature of voting rights, which I've been involved in too, in what we call felon disfranchisement. The notion that you lose all of your voting rights because you're convicted of a particular kind of crime, a felony. And it's in 11 of our 50 states, you lose it permanently. And in only 2 of our 50 states, you can still vote from a prison cell. Just like you could in Puerto Rico, in Canada, Israel, South Africa. So that notion about who is meritorious enough to vote, it can't be the person over there with a felony conviction, and it can't be the person over there because they're not smart enough. It all goes hand in hand with this notion that voting is some kind of quintessential exercise in democracy that's only limited to the best, only limited to those who are good, only limited to those who are worthy. That's what the Voting Rights Act allows us to battle, those notions. Because al fin y al cabo, the people who voted for John F. Kennedy for president, many of them voted for John F. Kennedy because he was Catholic, puro y final, right? The first Catholic president. I assume some people voted for John F. Kennedy because he was Democrat, punto y final. I also assume some people voted for John F. Kennedy because he looked better than Richard Nixon, punto y final. Whatever it took for that galvanization of voters to elect their president of the United States is a complex function of how voting behavior exists in this country. But the last thing we can allow is for the authorities to condition the vote on extraneous matters about worthiness and character. And I think that's the legacy of this work.
I'm just going to ask you to identify yourself when you speak, when you make a comment.
Can I go back to the gentleman's comments? I was just thinking about, give you some inside information about my dad. And yeah, he was all of that, what you say. I think that was quite accurate. And he did a lot of things that were very considerate. I'm very grateful that a lot of things about both my parents, and that they were able to live so long into my adulthood. But there are certain things that for some reason I just say, oh, well, this was a really great thing. When I was in Puerto Rico for staying with my aunt in the summer, I was a kid. I was you know, I was a real baseball fan. I mean, I was a Yankee fan, but I followed everything, the Cardinals, the Orioles, all the World Series, and I was always reading the standings and the leaders. And when I went to Puerto Rico, I mean, I couldn't pick up the daily news and the TV, just a couple of channels, and I was totally out of the baseball loop and all that. But I remember, and I was going over some stuff, and I hope I kept it, but it was this letter that he sent me saying, handwritten. He said, David, I'm sending you the latest standings here. And, you know, sure enough, I said, wow, everything is there. I got the league leaders, the standings, and all that. So he was surprisingly thoughtful in many respects. And I know he has his critics and all that, but those are the kind of things I remember. And then I recently, my 6th grade teacher contacted me, looked me up or something, a great guy. And he reminded me that during we had these things, public school, open school week, where the parents would come in. And so he reminded me that my dad actually came for open school week. This was probably when he was borough president. And he stayed the whole morning. And then after that, all the parents went away. But my dad came back after lunch. So it just gives you an idea that he was, you know, and he corrected the Spanish of Mr. Hassett. Mr. Hassett was giving us a little lingo there, and he said, no, you didn't pronounce it right. So, Just thought I'd throw it in.
Other questions, comments, remembrances?
Yes, Andy Torres from Lehman College. David, giving voice to one of the criticisms of him. There was this episode when he was commissioner, I don't know if it was housing or whatever, during the Wagner administration, where his role was to enable the urban renewal policies, right, for the west side of Manhattan that ultimately led to Lincoln Center, but as an outcome, right, a casualty of that was the displacement of a lot of black and Puerto Ricans who lived in those affordable housing of the day. Did he ever comment on that subsequently in retrospect about either the criticisms leveled against him about that or his own role during that period? Or if anyone else on the panel has any knowledge of that?
It might be in his book somewhere, but he was, yeah, I even did some research. I saw the directive that there was this thing that you're supposed to move and so forth, but he was a politician, and he was, look, even his initial appointment to commissioner, there was a lot of politics involved in that too. He had run for district leader in 1961. The case was all tied up in the courts, and he was challenging DeSapio and Santangelo and all that, and one way they got rid of him was to just say, okay, we're going to appoint you. And a lot of Puerto Ricans said, you should have taken the case forward. It would have helped a lot of people. So I think you can look at anybody's career and find junctures where they may have made strategic moves, and it happens.
David, in the article that you wrote about your aunt in the encyclopedia, where you mentioned that she really was a guiding light to him in terms of his political baptism. Could you say something about that?
Well, what can I say? Things were very tough, and Yaya got him there. He had to fend for himself. He had to survive in California, and Yaya had a lot of other things on her plate. But yeah, she was able to talk to Tony Mendez and get him down. She had, I guess he ran a jewelry store or something like that, and it was a close community in El Barrio, and Yaya used to go to the La Marqueta, and she talked to all the different immigrant groups, and she knew a lot of people, so she did that. But he also knew Judge Nunez, so it was a combination of factors that got him into the club, the political clubs, and she was a part of it, yeah. But he would like to think that he did it on his own, everything was his own.
Yeah, I think I have a question and a comment. First of all, I want to thank both of you. Fantastic at the three of you. But the panelists, I mean, just join everybody else saying what a great presentation both of you made and open up our eyes and everything. And besides, somebody was looking for papers for Herman. You could go to my basement or my garage. My wife was his Herman's secretary for all these years, and there's boxes there from 1965 on up to now. So take them out, and I'll be more than glad. As a matter of fact, I'll drop them off if you want them. They're there. My comment was more than anything, it was on the morality issue of Herman. He graduated in 1951. He was the top of his class. He didn't run for office till 1961. That was 10 years. And the immorality of the voting situation in the United States, everybody knows what that was. I mean, Juan made a beautiful presentation about that. Just like slavery was legal, but it was immoral. Women's voting was illegal, but it was immoral. People in the South, they don't know how to read or write, but they were voting. As long as you were white, you could vote. And Herman, my question is, were these people, knowing the violent nature of this country, were they not afraid, fear for their lives, what they were doing? Because, like you said, Juan said before, it did not only help Puerto Rican, but it helped all Asians, Mexicans, and so on and so forth. I mean, it is something that I look at it and I say, there's somebody trying to teach somebody else not only what's legal, what is right, but morality, teaching somebody else. I think what he left was a legacy of morality. I think people who were against the Puerto Ricans and other people voting got a big lesson in what is morally right, morally correct. That is something that I'm pretty sure when they were sitting in the house, they were thinking about it, or today, looking at a black president and saying, we made a big mistake. And I think the moral issue from Herman and the rest of people like him is something that will always remain with me. And I think it goes all the way back to his family when you mentioned about your tia Yeya, she's working for Puerto and giving out food to the Calle and Caguas and working. He must have seen some of this. And this is what he brought, I believe, to the city of New York. And I'm asking again, was there at any time any type of threat against those people? Juan?
I haven't seen it in any of the accounts that I've read of the individuals who were very, very successful in pushing for the Voting Rights Act amendments at the time. But David, I'm not sure if you are aware of any time that he felt afraid. That's an excellent question. I have no idea.
First of all, shout out to Ramon and to Edme, who started with my dad's campaign. What was it, 1965?
I just returned from Vietnam when I got suckered into that. But my wife, because I was going to marry, that's when we got married. You know, so she said, she worked for him. So I said,
it was a big deal. And some relatives, Eliezer Zayas, who gave me some of the early family photos, he came in to work on the campaign. Luis Munoz Marin worked on the campaign. It galvanized a lot of attention there. So by a certain time, things were moving. The early years were very tough. I would cite the early 60s as being really difficult because there was an entrenched ethnic change going in El Barrio, and the Italian community was not going to hand over the keys. And my dad was a very important part. And he was fearless. He would go out and he'd show up. He'd bring me, you know, whatever he had to do.
Well, you were his protection.
I was a human shield, yeah. And because according to the old mafia rules, you couldn't mess with anybody if they brought their kid there. So, but he had death threats. And I remember one time the bricks were flying off. He used to establish himself on the Lucky Corner, 116th and Lexington Avenue, which was very famous in El Barrio history, going back to Marc Antonio and La Guardia. That's where they used to meet just before the big elections. And he would make speeches there, and it was, he'd get threats, and the mafia would come out. Then there would be, he said he never knew there was a Puerto Rican mafia, but the Puerto Rican mafia showed up all of a sudden. People would be coming out, and that's what happened. It was, the closest thing I can say was I was in the, he got me a ticket. He was in Congress. He was unable to attend, but the big game at the Knicks, the only time I saw the Knicks play back then when they were playing the Lakers, and Willis came in and shocked the whole Laker team, and everybody started to roar. Madison Square Garden was just trembling. That was kind of what it was like at a Herman Badillo rally. He was, people just got their emotions into it. It was really, you had to be there. And the mayoralty campaigns were like that, and the Puerto Rican campaign. But the beginning, yeah, a lot of stuff could have happened, and there never would have been a borough presidency.
I don't see any other hands, and yes, we're coming to an end. Thank you so much for the presentations. So my introduction to Juan was through Angelo. I said, wow, he's right. He's right.